I was patrolling at a popular ski resort when I saw small bits of snow rolling and fresh debris at the bottom of certain slopes, so I radioed the resort manager Blake to close the resort in case of an avalanche. But he said no, because it was the biggest weekend of the year, and closing would mean losing $1.2 million in one day. When I got a text from my brother Tommy saying he was bringing his wife Carmen up for her first Black Diamond run, I started setting up avalanche warning flags without authorization, even though Blake threatened to destroy my mountain credentials and called me a terrorist over the radio. I was patrolling at a popular ski resort when I saw small bits of snow rolling and fresh debris at the bottom of certain slopes. I radioed the resort manager Blake to close the resort in case of an avalanche, but he said no. This was the biggest weekend of the year, and closing the resort would mean losing $1.2 million in one day. Blake, I'm not joking. These cracks weren't here yesterday. I tried to keep my voice steady. I don't care. My resort, my rules, he snapped. Sign off on your patrol report and get back to base. Mark it safe or I'll find someone who will. Maybe someone who actually wants to keep their mountain credentials. That's when the worst possible thing happened. My phone buzzed. It was my brother Tommy. Bringing Carmen up for her first black slope. Can't wait. I immediately texted back. Don't. Mountain is unstable. Take the bunny slopes. Lol, okay, mom. Blake just said conditions are perfect on the PA. Blake is wrong. You always do this. Carmen's so excited. Stop trying to scare us. I didn't sign the report. Screw Blake. I started skiing directly to the high-risk areas, setting up avalanche warning flags even though I didn't have authorization. That's when I heard the first whoomph. The entire slope had just settled an inch. Blake's voice crackled over the radio. Jake, get back to base. Now. I ignored him and kept placing warnings. A small slide released on the adjacent peak, maybe 50 tons of snow. People were starting to notice. A few skiers stopped, looking up at where the snow had fallen. Is that normal? I heard someone ask. Blake immediately got on the PA. Folks, that's just our morning grooming crew doing avalanche control. All part of keeping you safe. My phone exploded with texts from other volunteers. Temp spike 10 degrees. Just saw a slab release on the north face. Blake won't let me report it. Another whoomph. Louder this time. Several people near me actually felt it. A woman grabbed her kid's hand. Let's go back down, honey. Blake on the PA again. Ladies and gentlemen, those settling sounds are completely normal. In fact, they mean the snow is stabilizing. Better conditions than ever at the summit. More families were leaving the slopes despite his announcement. I texted Tommy again. The mountain is literally falling apart. Please believe me. Stop being dramatic. Already in line for the summit lift. Blake sent security after me, his voice on the radio getting nastier. Jake, you're destroying our biggest weekend. You'll never work any mountain again. That's when another slide broke loose. Bigger this time. 100 tons, taking out trees. Blake, frantic now on the PA. That was a controlled detonation. We're making the mountain safer for you. Please continue enjoying your day. Now people were really noticing. The lift lines were getting shorter. Parents pulling their kids off the mountain. Blake switched tactics on the radio, trying to sound reasonable. Jake, think about the families who saved all year for this trip. That's when another slide hit. This one was visible from the base lodge. I could see people inside pointing through the windows. The lunch crowd was abandoning their tables, moving toward the exits. Blake got on the PA again, desperation creeping in. Free drinks. Free drinks at all bars for the next hour. Please remain calm. These are controlled slides. But experienced skiers were already leaving. The gondola line to the summit was thinning out, except Tommy and Carmen were already on it, halfway up. Blake came on the radio, screaming now. Jake, I'm calling the police. You're committing terrorism. Terrorism. More slides. Constant small ones now, like the mountain was clearing its throat. I kept firing warning flares. Blake kept countering on the PA. Disregard the flares. A mentally unstable ex-employee is having an episode. That's when everyone heard it. The rumble wasn't subtle. It came from deep inside the mountain. Conversations stopped. Everyone turned toward Black Diamond. Oh crap, someone said. Oh crap, crap, crap. People started running. Parents scooping up kids. Blake's voice shaking now. Please evacuate in an orderly. The mountain exploded. The entire face of Black Diamond broke loose at once. Through my binoculars, I saw Tommy and Carmen near the summit, tiny dots about to be swallowed. When the roar finally stopped, the silence was somehow worse. I was digging through the debris field when I heard the first moans. A teenage girl, half buried, her snowboard still attached to one foot. I pulled her free, and she immediately vomited. Her lips blue from the cold. My dad, she kept saying. My dad was right next to me. More survivors started calling out. Their voices came from everywhere and nowhere. I ran and continued searching, now for my brother and his wife. I found Carmen first, unconscious in a tree well. Her face was purple, but she had a pulse. Then Tommy's beacon led me to him, 6 feet under, completely buried. I dug like an animal, throwing snow behind me, my fingers torn through my gloves. When I finally reached him, his eyes were open, but unseeing. No breath, no pulse. I started CPR, pumping his chest while tasting my own tears. Other rescuers arrived, but I wouldn't let them take over. 3 minutes of CPR later, he coughed. Pink foam and blood came up, but he was breathing. The helicopters started arriving within 20 minutes. Paramedics were everywhere. I saw a father carrying his son's body. That's when Blake showed up. He was clean, untouched by snow, still wearing his office clothes and dress shoes, picking his way through the destruction like he was worried about getting his pants dirty. He walked straight to the first investigator he saw, some state police captain, and I heard him clear as day. This is my name's fault. He incited panic. If he hadn't interfered with our operations, everyone would have evacuated safely when I gave the order. The investigator looked at Blake, then at me, then back at Blake, and I could see him trying to figure out what was real. 2 state troopers grabbed my arms and walked me to their mobile command unit parked near the base lodge, while Blake kept talking to more officials. I sat in the metal chair inside the trailer watching through the small window as Blake shook hands with resort board members who had arrived in their expensive cars. Officer Dana Brown sat across from me and slid a voice recorder across the table and told me to start from when I first noticed the instability. My hands kept shaking as I described the whoomp sound. sounds, the settling snow, how Blake threatened my credentials if I didn't mark the mountain safe. Every detail I could remember. She wrote everything down while more investigators came in and out asking questions about the timeline. That evening, they finally let me go to the hospital where Tommy was sedated in the ICU, with machines breathing for him. Carmen sat next to his bed holding his hand, her own arm in a sling and cuts on her face covered with bandages. She told me the doctors said he might have permanent lung damage from being buried so long. Through the hospital window, I could see news vans setting up in the parking lot, and inside the waiting room, Blake's face was already on TV, calling it an unexpected natural disaster. The next morning, a man in an expensive suit found me in the hospital cafeteria and introduced himself as the resort's lawyer. He put a document on the table offering to cover all medical expenses if I signed a statement saying I acted independently without authorization when I placed those warning flags. I tore the paper in half right in front of him and dropped the pieces on the floor. My phone buzzed immediately with a text from Blake saying, "I just made the biggest mistake of my life." That evening, Melissa Crawford called me from her car, her voice shaking as she told me she had copies of every safety report I filed this season. She said Blake made her alter them after I submitted them, but she kept all the originals on her personal drive. She started crying when she told me 17 people were still missing under the snow. The Mountain Safety Board sent me an official summons for an emergency hearing about my unauthorized warning actions the next day. I walked into the conference room to find Blake already there with 3 lawyers showing the board-edited radio transcripts. They made it sound like I panicked for no reason and caused unnecessary chaos that led to the avalanche deaths. The board members looked at me like I was crazy and voted to suspend my credentials pending a full investigation. The next morning, Rachel Winters found me at Tommy's bedside, her eyes red from crying for days. She told me her daughter Emma lost 3 toes to frostbite, and her friend Chloe didn't make it out at all. She showed me her phone with Blake on the morning news, calling the avalanche an act of God that nobody could have predicted. Officer Brown called me down to the station for a formal interview where she asked detailed questions about Blake's PA announcements. She confirmed they had multiple witnesses who heard him say the slides were controlled detonations to keep people on the mountain. But Blake's lawyers were already claiming he was relying on my expertise as head of ski patrol when he made those statements. I went to clean out my locker at the patrol station while the other patrollers watched without saying anything. Marcus, a rookie I trained last season, walked by and slipped a USB drive into my hand without looking at me. He whispered that it was helmet cam footage from that morning showing the crown fractures clearly before walking away. Blake held a press conference announcing a memorial fund for victims while pledging full cooperation with all investigations. Behind him on the stage, the resort's sign announced they were reopening with discounted lift tickets to help the community heal. I watched from my apartment as cars started filling the parking lot again and skiers lined up for the lifts like nothing had happened. Tommy finally woke up properly on day 8, gasping and clawing at the breathing tubes in his throat. He kept saying he couldn't breathe, that everything was white and he couldn't breathe, his eyes wild with panic. Carmen wouldn't let me get close to him and told me he was following me up there because he trusted me to know if it was safe. 2 days later, I sat in my truck outside the resort parking lot, watching cars pull in for spring break week. Families were unloading ski gear and kids were running around excited about hitting the slopes. Every time I heard a child laugh, my stomach twisted because I kept seeing that father carrying his son's body through all that snow. The resort looked exactly the same, like 11 people hadn't just died there. The next morning, I was sitting at a coffee shop when Dr. Hayes walked in and came straight to my table. He sat down and leaned forward, speaking quietly about how Blake's security had tried to stop them from setting up the medical station until lawyers arrived. He slid his personal notes across the table, showing they'd lost 12 minutes because of it. I took photos of every page before handing them back. The following day, a process server found me at home with papers from the resort's lawyers. They were suing me for $3.2 million in economic damages from my reckless fear-mongering. My public defender looked at the filing and shook his head, saying they were trying to bankrupt me into silence. The next afternoon, Melissa texted me to meet her at a diner 2 towns over. She kept looking over her shoulder as she pulled out papers, showing Blake had gotten a geology report 3 weeks before the avalanche warning about the instability. She said he buried it because fixing the problem would have meant closing for peak season. I photographed those documents too before she grabbed them back and left through the kitchen exit. The day after that, I drove Tommy to his first physical therapy session. The therapist measured his lung capacity at 40% and explained he'd never ski again, might struggle with stairs for years. Tommy stared at the ceiling the whole time she talked and wouldn't look at me even when I tried to help him to the car. The next morning, the safety hearing resumed at the county building. Blake's lawyers presented weather data, claiming unprecedented conditions no one could have predicted. I showed them Marcus's helmet footage with all the clear warning signs from that morning. The board members looked at each other and said they needed more time to deliberate. That evening, I came out to find my truck tires slashed and killer spray painted across the windshield. The security guard at the lot said their cameras had malfunctioned for exactly that hour. My phone buzzed with a text from Blake saying it was a shame about my truck and that mountain towns had strong feelings about people who hurt their economy. The next day, Officer Williams called to tell me the FBI was taking over the investigation for multiple interstate commerce violations. She mentioned Blake's lawyer had just hired a crisis management firm that specialized in disaster deflection. That night, I was sitting with Carmen in Tommy's hospital room while he slept. She told me the doctor said he had PTSD and woke up feeling like he was still buried under the snow. She looked exhausted and said she'd been so excited to learn to ski that Tommy had wanted to show her everything he loved about the mountain. The next morning, I walked through town to get groceries and felt eyes on me everywhere I went. The local paper had run an op-ed about rush to judgment and mountain forgotten tradition. The bartender who usually knew my name pretended not to see me when I walked past his window. This whole town's economy lived and died by that resort, and I was the guy who'd tried to shut it down. The next day, Rachel showed up at the resort's main entrance with a process server and what looked like half the news stations in Colorado. I watched it happen from the parking lot where I'd gone to meet with the state investigators again. Blake walked out of the building in his usual suit, saw the cameras, and his whole face changed into this fake, concerned look. The process server handed him the papers while Rachel stood there shaking. Blake took the documents and immediately started talking to the cameras about how tragic this all was and how some lawyers were trying to profit from everyone's pain. Rachel tried to say something about her daughter, but her voice cracked and she started crying right there on live TV. Blake put on this sympathetic face and said something about understanding a mother's grief while the cameras kept rolling. By that night, the news was calling her an opportunist. The next morning, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. It was a patroller from Vail saying a bunch of them had been talking and they'd all seen the same stuff at their resorts. Management pushing them to keep slopes open when conditions were bad. Reports getting buried. One guy from Breckenridge said they'd fired him 2 years ago for refusing to sign off on a dangerous slope. They had documentation going back 5 years showing this was happening everywhere, but my situation was the worst they'd seen. I drove to the hospital to see Tommy that afternoon. He'd been awake for days but hadn't wanted to see me. When I walked in, he just stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then he asked if I really knew how bad it was when I texted him. I told him about the whoomph sounds I'd heard that morning, the crown fractures I'd seen forming, how Blake threatened to destroy my career if I didn't sign the report. Tommy closed his eyes and said he should have listened. The next day, a courier showed up at my door with a subpoena from Blake's legal team. They wanted my entire work history from every resort I'd ever worked at. Within hours, they'd found some report from 6 years ago where I'd marked a slope as moderate risk that never actually slid. Their filing called it a pattern of incompetence, even though that assessment had been correct and no one got hurt. The Colorado Attorney General announced they were opening a criminal investigation, but Blake had already hired the former Attorney General as his defense lawyer. The news covered it like some celebrity scandal with graphics and theme music, instead of talking about the 11 people who died. That's when everything started falling apart fast. My landlord knocked on my door saying he needed the apartment back for family and gave me 30 days to get out. The bank called about irregularities in my accounts and froze everything pending review. My insurance company sent a letter dropping my coverage because of pending litigation. Blake was destroying my life piece by piece. Melissa called me crying, saying they knew she'd talk to me and she was being transferred to Phoenix immediately. Before she left, she dropped a box at my door and ran to her car. Inside were 5 years of safety reports that Blake had ordered destroyed. Every single one showed the same pattern of him ignoring warnings to keep the slopes open. I was at the grocery store when Dr. Hayes found me in the cereal aisle. He looked around to make sure no one was listening, then whispered that the resort's lawyers were pressuring the hospital to change the triage timeline. They wanted it to look like the delays were medical decisions, not security blocking access. He kept looking over his shoulder and said he had kids and couldn't lose his job. The next night, I went to the diner where all the rescue workers used to meet after shifts. The waitress I'd known for years wouldn't even look at me when she took my order. The TV was showing Blake at some press conference announcing a scholarship fund for the victims while his lawyers fought their families in court. I ate my eggs alone while everyone in the place pretended I wasn't there. Someone posted my address online the next day with a photo of my apartment building and the words, "Murderer lives here," in red text. By evening, there were 20 people outside with signs. Some were resort employees scared of losing their jobs. Others were just angry about their town's reputation being ruined. Carmen called from the hospital saying protesters were there too, yelling at anyone who talked to her or Tommy. The next morning, my phone rang with a blocked number, and when I answered, a woman said she was from the Denver Post. She'd been tracking resort safety violations for months and found Blake's name connected to 3 deaths at a different resort 5 years ago. The families had signed sealed settlements, but she had copies of the original complaints. She needed my patrol reports and any documentation I had to break the pattern open. I met her at a coffee shop outside town and handed over everything I'd saved, including photos of the warning signs I'd placed. The next day, 2 FBI agents showed up at my door with badges and serious faces. They drove me to the federal building downtown, where they questioned me for 6 hours straight. They had Blake's emails to investors from the morning of the avalanche, saying it was a minor incident being contained with minimal impact expected. He sent those while 11 people were still buried under the snow. They showed me security footage of him watching the avalanche happen from his office window, then walking to his computer to type those emails. The agents took notes on everything and said they'd be in touch. When I got home, Carmen called saying Tommy was being released, but would need oxygen tanks to breathe. The next morning, I helped move him from the hospital bed to a wheelchair, which took 15 minutes because he kept having to stop and catch his breath. He looked at the wheelchair and said to no one that he was supposed to teach kids to ski next season. His hands shook when he tried to hold a cup of water. That afternoon, Blake's lawyers released edited recordings of my radio calls, making it sound like I was panicking and not making sense. The local news played them every hour with headlines about rogue patrol officer. My old co-workers stopped answering my texts, and when I ran into one at the grocery store, he walked the other way. Rachel called me that night saying she was getting the other families together. They were making videos of the people who died, showing them as real people, not just numbers in a news story. She posted them online, and within hours, they had thousands of shares. People started asking why Blake was still running the resort. The next morning, I was driving to Tommy's when my brakes went soft. I pumped them hard, but nothing happened, and I had to use the emergency brake to stop. The mechanic found the brake lines had been cut clean through with professional tools. Officer Brown couldn't prove who did it, but she started having patrol cars drive by my apartment every few hours. She told me Blake was getting desperate and to watch my back. I spent the next day at the library going through old newspaper archives. Blake's name came up at 4 different resorts over 15 years with 12 total deaths. Every time it was blamed on acts of God or patrol failures. The pattern was right there in black and white. Carmen asked me to come help with Tommy's breathing exercises because he only tried when I was there. She said he wasn't angry at me, just at everything else. Tommy gripped my hand during the exercises, and I could feel him fighting for each breath. His face turned red from the effort, and sweat ran down his neck. The next morning, I drove past the resort at dawn just to see it. Fresh snow covered everything like nothing had happened. Families were already lining up for the early lifts, and kids were laughing in the parking lot. The mountain looked perfect and peaceful and completely indifferent to what it had done. That afternoon, I got a certified letter saying the state safety board had revoked my credentials permanently for reckless endangerment. Blake sent out a press release within an hour, talking about vindication and professional standards. My 18 years of perfect safety record meant nothing now. 2 nights later, someone knocked on my door at 2 a.m., and I found Marcus standing there with his helmet cam in his hands. He pushed past me into my living room and plugged the camera into my TV without asking. The footage started playing, and there was Blake at the summit that morning, checking the exact same cracks I'd reported. He ran his hand along the fracture lines and shook his head, and then 10 minutes later, the video showed him on a conference call telling investors conditions were perfect. Marcus said his camera was supposed to be off, but it wasn't. I copied the footage to 3 different drives while Marcus sat on my couch drinking the coffee I made him. The next morning, the Denver journalist called me saying her story was going live in an hour. When it posted online, 3 families from Blake's previous resorts in Utah and Wyoming came forward with their own stories about suppressed avalanche warnings and threatened employees and 2 people who died in preventable slides. The story got picked up by national outlets within hours, and my phone wouldn't stop buzzing with interview requests. The day after that, a lawyer from Denver showed up at my apartment with a stack of papers saying she was taking our case pro bono. She sat at my kitchen table explaining that Blake's insurance company was already backing away because they don't cover criminal negligence. She filed subpoenas for 10 years of resort communications before she even finished her coffee. Tommy came over that afternoon, and I showed him Marcus's helmet footage for the first time. He watched himself and Carmen getting on the lift while the mountains started breaking apart above them. When the timestamp showed they were 15 seconds from being directly in the slide path, he whispered that if they'd been any later, they would have died. He threw up in my bathroom and then sat on the floor for 20 minutes. Blake called an emergency board meeting the next day, but someone recorded the whole thing on their phone. The audio leaked within hours, showing board members talking about liability mitigation and narrative control, but never once mentioning the 11 people who died. The recording went viral on Twitter and Reddit, with people calling for criminal charges. Resort employees started texting me privately after that. The head of lift operations admitted Blake ordered him to keep the summit lift running even after he raised safety concerns. He said he had 4 kids, but couldn't live with what happened anymore. More employees reached out with similar stories about Blake threatening their jobs if they reported problems. Rachel brought 5 other families to my apartment the next evening. They sat in my living room sharing photos of their kids and spouses who died in the avalanche. Tommy listened to every story and realized he was the only adult who survived being completely buried. He told them he had to speak for everyone who couldn't. 2 days later, I was buying milk at the grocery store when Blake appeared with a camera crew. He shoved a microphone in my face, demanding to know how it felt to destroy hundreds of jobs. I stayed calm and asked him how it felt to value profit over 11 lives. The video split our town, with some people supporting Blake and others finally admitting they knew something was wrong. I drove to the mountain the next morning and found flowers and photos and crossed ski poles growing into a memorial at the base. Someone left a note that said they knew the truth, and some of them always knew. Resort security kept removing items, but people kept bringing more flowers and photos and candles. 2 days after that, FBI agents showed up at the resort with search warrants. They loaded servers and computers and boxes of records into trucks, while Blake's lawyer stood there calling it a witch hunt, but couldn't stop them. The agents also searched Blake's house and his office and took 20 years of documents. Local news filmed the whole thing, with Blake standing in his driveway yelling about government overreach while agents carried evidence boxes past him. The insurance company filed their lawsuit 2 days later, claiming Blake knew about the danger and hid it from everyone. Their lawyers found proof that Blake bought extra insurance just 2 days before the avalanche happened. The filing said 3 words that made my stomach drop. He knew everything. Tommy had to give his testimony from his hospital bed with machines beeping around him and an oxygen mask on his face. The lawyers set up cameras, and Tommy described being buried alive while Blake's lawyers kept trying to stop him from talking. He said it felt like being trapped in concrete and knowing he was going to die right there. Blake's lawyers objected 17 times, but the judge on the video call let Tommy keep going. Dr. Hayes called me 2 days later and said he was fixing his official report to include those 12 minutes the security guards wasted. He knew Blake might get him fired, but he couldn't live with lying about what really happened that day. The town meeting on day 58 turned into chaos when one of Blake's own investors stood up and demanded answers about geology reports. Blake started screaming about ungrateful parasites living off his mountain, and everyone saw who he really was. 2 nights later, families of the victims held a candlelight vigil at the community center downtown. Half the town showed up, even though Blake had threatened to fire anyone who went. I stood there with hundreds of candles glowing, and for the first time since the avalanche, I didn't feel completely alone. The state pulled the resort's operating license the next morning, and Blake's emergency injunction got denied by the judge. She said public safety was more important than profit, and the resort closed for the first time in 40 years. Blake's former assistant found me outside the courthouse and handed me a flash drive drive with 2 years of recordings. She had audio of Blake talking to investors about acceptable casualty rates and calculating that lawsuits would cost less than closing. Her hands shook as she told me she'd been waiting for the right time to share what she knew. Tommy called me from the hospital 2 days later, and Carmen was crying in the background. He'd just walked 10 feet from his bed to the chair without any help from the nurses. The doctor had said he might never walk again, but Tommy was determined to walk into court on his own. The FBI discovered Blake had been moving money to offshore accounts since the day of the avalanche. They froze everything they could find, but millions were already gone, and his lawyer quit the case. I went back to the mountain on day 70 and stood where the avalanche started looking at the new warning signs. The mountain didn't care about any of our human drama or Blake's greed or the lawsuits. It just existed the way mountains do, but we had chosen to ignore what it was telling us. 2 days later, I got a call from someone on the resort board saying they were voting to fire Blake that afternoon. I drove to the resort and saw news vans already setting up in the parking lot. The board meeting was supposed to be private, but word had gotten out somehow. I waited outside the main office building with about 50 other people, including families from the avalanche. After 3 hours, someone came out and said Blake was officially terminated, but he wouldn't leave his office. Through the windows, we could see him at his desk with 2 private security guards blocking the door from inside. The state police showed up with 6 officers who went upstairs while we all watched from outside. 20 minutes later, they came back down with Blake in handcuffs, and his face was bright red with anger. The photographers got their shots as the cops walked him to their car, and by that night, his arrest photo was on every news website. 2 days after that, the town council held public hearings at the town hall about what to do with the resort. I sat in the back row listening to families talk about how they'd been scared to speak up for years because Blake controlled so many jobs in town. The mayor stood up and said Blake had held the whole town hostage with money and threats. Marcus showed up at my apartment on day 76 with 3 other patrollers I knew from the mountain. They were starting their own independent safety company and wanted me as an advisor even without my credentials. Marcus said they'd never let management override safety calls again, no matter what. 2 days later, I was eating breakfast when the news broke that Blake had been arrested on federal charges. The list was long, including criminal negligence and wire fraud and conspiracy, and 11 counts of involuntary manslaughter. His new public defender looked like a kid fresh out of law school standing next to him at the arraignment. The man who used to own half the town now had nothing but a court-appointed lawyer. The grand jury met 2 days after that and indicted Blake plus 3 board members who had known about the suppressed safety reports. Officer Davis called me that afternoon to say my documentation had saved the whole case, and they had enough for consecutive life sentences. Tommy came over on day 82, and we sat on my couch watching old skiing videos from when we were kids. He said he didn't blame me for what happened, and that he blamed himself for not listening, and Blake for everything else. We didn't hug, but something changed between us that day. Rachel was organizing the families to file civil suits against Blake personally on day 84, and her lawyers had found a way to pierce the corporate protection. Her daughter Emma was there in her wheelchair missing 3 toes from frostbite, and Rachel said Blake didn't get to hide behind the resort anymore. Then Blake's wife filed for divorce and got a restraining order 2 days later. She gave investigators recordings she'd been making for years of Blake talking about moving money offshore if things went bad. The recordings had him planning escape routes and talking about which countries didn't have extradition treaties. The resort reopened on day 88 under new management with the strictest safety rules in the country. I stood at the base watching families come back, but most kids who were there during the avalanche wouldn't go near the slopes. Parents held their children's hands tighter, and some families just came to look at the mountain, then left without skiing. The trauma was spreading through generations, and you could see it in how people moved differently on the mountain now. 2 days later, prosecutors called me to their office downtown to prepare for testimony. They had boxes stacked to the ceiling with 400 hours of recordings and 10,000 documents and 60 witnesses ready to testify. The lead prosecutor showed me Blake's own emails where he documented every safety violation and cover-up, thinking he was protecting himself legally. She said it was the strongest case she'd seen in 20 years, and Blake had basically documented his own crimes. 2 weeks passed before the FBI called with news that made my stomach drop. They'd been digging into Blake's past and found something nobody expected. The agent showed me documents from a mine collapse in Montana 15 years ago. Different name back then, Robert Harrison, but same face in the photos. Same pattern too. Safety inspector warned about unstable tunnels, and Robert Harrison fired him. 23 miners died when the main shaft collapsed. He disappeared before charges could be filed and somehow got new credentials as Blake Harrington. The FBI agent spread out more files showing 3 other incidents across different states. Always the same thing. Safety warnings ignored, people died, Blake vanished and showed up somewhere else with slightly different paperwork. 2 days after that bombshell, 3 former board members contacted prosecutors. They'd been scared to talk before, but now wanted immunity deals. One of them, an older guy who'd served 10 years on the board, brought recordings from his phone. Blake's voice was clear on the audio, telling him he'd bury anyone who got in his way, not just career-wise either. The recording had Blake describing how he'd handled a whistleblower at his last job who ended up having a mysterious accident. The board member's hands shook as he played more recordings where Blake threatened to destroy his family's business if he didn't vote to keep the slopes open. 2 more board members confirmed similar threats and produced emails where Blake detailed exactly how he'd ruin them. Day 96 was hard because Carmen finally came back to the mountain for the first time since the avalanche. She wouldn't go past the base lodge and just stood there staring up at where they'd been buried. Her whole body shook even though it was warm inside. She told me she loved skiing for exactly 1 hour of her life and now couldn't even look at snow without shaking. Tommy held her hand, but I could see him struggling too with his oxygen oxygen tank, making that constant hissing sound. The investigation exploded 2 days later when forensic accountants found Blake's hidden offshore accounts, millions in bribes to safety inspectors across Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming. The FBI started contacting other resorts and found the same inspectors had signed off on dangerous conditions everywhere Blake had worked. Resort owners across the country started calling emergency meetings and firing anyone connected to Blake. News crews showed up at every major ski area asking about their safety protocols. The memorial dedication happened on day 100 at the base of the mountain. 11 stone pillars stood in a circle with names, ages, and what each victim had dreamed of doing. The youngest was 8 years old, and her father spoke through tears about how she'd wanted to be a ski instructor like Tommy. His voice broke when he said she was gone because one man decided money mattered more than lives. The crowd of hundreds stood silent, except for crying. Tommy started teaching again 2 days later, but not regular skiing. He worked with survivors who'd been injured in the avalanche, showing them adaptive techniques with special equipment. His oxygen tank didn't slow him down as he helped a teenage girl find her balance on modified skis. He told her the mountain didn't betray them, people did. She nodded and managed her first successful run since losing part of her leg. Blake tried to kill himself in his cell on day 104. Guards found him with bed sheets around his neck but got him down in time. His lawyer immediately requested psychiatric evaluation, claiming Blake had suffered a complete mental breakdown. Rachel and other victims' families were furious when they heard. She told reporters Blake was trying to escape accountability again, just like he'd escaped consequences his whole life. The lawyer filed motion after motion, trying to get Blake moved to a psychiatric facility instead of jail. The resort workers voted 2 days later to create something called the 11 Angels Protocol. Any safety concern reported anonymously would trigger automatic slope closure until independent inspection cleared it. No manager could override it, and firing someone for safety reports would mean criminal charges. Workers from other resorts started pushing for the same rules at their mountains. Dr. Hayes called me on day 108 with unexpected news. The new board hadn't just kept him on staff, they'd promoted him to head of emergency services. He said my standing up to Blake had given others courage to speak out. The new board wanted people who'd tell the truth even when it cost them. He asked if I'd consider coming back, but I couldn't answer yet. I spent day 110 packing my apartment to leave town after the trial. In a box of winter gear, I found my original patrol jacket. It still smelled like avalanche debris, that mix of sulfur and pine and death that I'd never forget. My hands shook holding it, and I had to sit down. The jacket had a tear across the shoulder from when I'd been digging for Tommy. Bloodstains that wouldn't wash out. Evidence tape still stuck to one sleeve from when investigators had examined it. I folded it carefully and put it in a separate box marked evidence. The next few weeks crawled by while lawyers prepared for trial. On day 112, Blake's psychiatrist signed the papers saying he was mentally fit to stand trial, and someone leaked the security footage from the hospital showing Blake talking to his lawyer about defense strategies just hours after his fake suicide attempt. Officer Miller watched the footage with me and shook his head. 2 days later, jury selection started, and Blake's lawyers tried to get rid of anyone who'd ever been skiing, anyone with kids, anyone who'd seen the news coverage. The judge shut most of it down and told them this affected the whole community. I drove to Tommy's house on day 116 and found him sitting on his porch without his oxygen tank for the first time since the avalanche. He stood up when he saw me and took deep breaths to show he could do it. He wanted Blake to see him breathing on his own when he testified. The prosecutor called me on day 118 and said they'd found Blake's personal journal in his seized laptop. She read me the entry from the morning of the avalanche, where Blake wrote about me trying to play hero again and how he'd deal with me after securing the weekend profits. My hands were shaking when I hung up. The trial started on day 120, and Blake walked in wearing a $3,000 suit, shoulders back, trying to look confident like he always did. Then he saw the gallery packed with survivors and families all wearing yellow avalanche beacons pinned to their shirts, and his face went white. The next day, I spent 7 hours on the witness stand, going through every warning I'd given, every threat Blake made, every sign we both saw. Blake's lawyer kept trying to make me look like some disgruntled employee who went rogue, but I stayed calm and let the evidence talk. They played my helmet cam footage on the courtroom screens over and over, Blake's voice clear as day telling people conditions were perfect while the mountain was collapsing. Tommy testified on day 122 and walked to the stand without any help, each step slow but steady. He told them about the darkness under the snow, about knowing he was going to die, about the weight crushing his chest. Blake wouldn't look at him, and Tommy's voice got stronger when he said 11 people didn't make it because Blake chose money over lives. The courtroom was dead silent when he stepped down. Rachel took the stand the next day with a laptop full of videos of her daughter's friend Chloe, who died at 14. She showed Chloe's birthday party from 2 weeks before the avalanche, the girl laughing and scared to go skiing, but wanting to impress her older brother. Rachel pointed right at Blake and said he murdered that child for $1.2 million in revenue. Blake finally took a stand on day 124, claiming he'd relied on my expertise, that I never properly conveyed how urgent the danger was. The prosecutor played Blake's own PA announcements telling people to keep skiing while bodies were being pulled from the snow. Blake's own lawyer actually objected to his client's evidence being shown. The jury went out on day 125 and came back 3 hours later. The judge asked for the verdict, and the foreman stood up and said guilty on all 11 counts of involuntary manslaughter, guilty on fraud, guilty on conspiracy, guilty on criminal negligence. Blake's legs gave out and he collapsed into his chair while the judge read out consecutive sentences that meant he'd never leave prison. The families in the gallery were crying and holding each other. Tommy grabbed my hand and squeezed it hard. Blake's lawyers tried to help him stand for the guards to take him away, but he couldn't get his legs to work. work. They had to basically carry him out while he kept saying this wasn't supposed to happen. The judge thanked the jury and said justice had been served for those 11 souls. Outside the courthouse, reporters were everywhere, but I just walked past them to my truck. This wasn't about me getting vindication. It was about those 11 people who should still be alive. I sat in my truck for a long time watching families leave the courthouse, some looking relieved, others just looking empty because no verdict would bring their loved ones back. Tommy texted me that he and Carmen were going to grief counseling together and invited me to join. I said yes. The mountain had taken so much from all of us, but at least Blake would pay for what he'd done. That night, I finally slept without nightmares for the first time since the avalanche. The next morning, I drove back to the courthouse where families were still gathering, some crying, others just standing there looking lost. Rachel walked over and grabbed my arm, her grip tight enough to hurt. It doesn't bring them back, but they didn't die for nothing. Behind her, guards were loading Blake into a transport van, his expensive suit replaced with an orange jumpsuit, his hands and feet chained together. The next day, the resort's board announced their complete restructuring plan on every news channel, giving patrol teams absolute veto power over any slope closure, requiring all safety reports to go directly to state authorities instead of management, and offering full settlements to every family without making them go through years of court battles. Other ski resorts across Colorado started scrambling to update their own policies before investigators came knocking on their doors. Tommy and Carmen had me over for dinner that night, and we ate in near silence, nobody mentioning the trial or the mountain, just passing food and refilling drinks, while Carmen showed me her new paintings of desert landscapes and ocean scenes, nothing with snow. Tommy's breathing was better, hitting 70% lung function according to his latest tests, and when he said he was getting stronger, we both knew he meant more than just his body recovering. 2 days later, an official letter arrived from the Mountain Safety Board, reversing my credential revocation, calling Blake's threats unprecedented coercion, and clearing me to work at any resort in North America again. I stared at the certificate for a long time before shoving it in a drawer because the thought of being on another mountain made my stomach turn. I drove to the memorial site at dawn when I knew nobody else would be there, finding 11 stone pillars arranged in a circle with names carved deep into the granite. Another man was already there, his hand pressed against one of the pillars, and we nodded at each other without speaking because some pain doesn't need words. The head of patrol training called me that afternoon, asking if I'd take a position teaching new patrollers how to spot avalanche conditions and, more importantly, how to stand up to management pressure. I accepted immediately because somebody had to make sure the next generation wouldn't get bullied into silence. Blake's sentencing hearing 3 days later packed the courtroom again as he stood and admitted to every single charge in detail, his voice breaking as he described becoming the mountain's enemy, hoping his confession would get him leniency. The judge gave him 165 years, consecutive not concurrent, and nobody in that room felt an ounce of sympathy. Tommy started going back to the bunny slopes with special breathing equipment, teaching a 7-year-old avalanche survivor how to trust the snow again, his oxygen levels dropping with the effort, but his determination never wavering. "We don't let fear win," I heard him tell the kid between labored breaths. I was packing boxes to move closer to Tommy and Carmen when Rachel called, explaining that the victims' families were creating a foundation for resort safety reform and wanted me to lead it. "Help us make sure this never happens again," she said, and I couldn't say no to that. Standing at the resort's new safety center 5 days later, the one they named after all 11 victims, I watched young patrollers training with their new authority to shut down any run without needing approval from anyone. Tommy stood next to me, breathing steadily without his oxygen tank for the first time since the avalanche, and Carmen joined us carrying 3 cups of hot chocolate instead of ski gear. "We survived," she said simply, and we stood there together, different people than we were before but not broken, watching fresh snow fall on a mountain that would never again put money ahead of lives.